We are scheduled to begin the book of Joshua as we continue our way through the Bible, but we'd be taking next week off anyway. So what we're going to do is we are going to start looking at the events surrounding Easter tonight. We're going to be looking at a message tonight called The Burden of the Cross. We'll be looking at Matthew chapter 27. If you'll turn there, Matthew chapter 27. And our launching point for this message will be in verse 32. Matthew 27 at verse 32. By the way, this weekend, we'll be looking at a Palm Sunday message. This weekend will be Palm Sunday. And then on Thursday night, we'll be looking at a message as it relates to Easter. Friday morning, we'll be looking at the sayings of Jesus from the cross. And then the following Sunday, be talking about the resurrection of Christ. And so want to get our minds and our hearts just really wrapped up in the events that transpired 2,000 years ago in the coming week. And so this evening, Matthew chapter 27, verse 32 reads this way. Now as they, the word they, pronoun, plural, speaking of Jesus, speaking of the Roman guards, Jesus has been condemned, scourged, and he's making his way now out of the praetorium and heading towards Golgotha or Calvary or the place of his crucifixion. Now as they came out, they found a man of Cyrene. Cyrene is in North Africa. Simon by name. Him they compelled to bear his cross. Again, I mentioned a moment ago that the message title for tonight is The Burden of the Cross. And here we see Jesus as he's making his way from the Antonia fortress to Calvary, or to the place of his crucifixion. It's a journey of about a half a mile that a man from North Africa was forced by the Roman soldiers to bear the cross on Jesus' behalf. Now, we're not told specifically why. John tells us that Jesus began the journey bearing his own cross, but somewhere along the way, Simon was forced to carry it. John put it like this, and Jesus, bearing his cross, went out to the place of the skull, which is called in Hebrew Golgotha. Matthew adds that along the way, they forced a man by the name of Simon to bear the cross for him. And so the implication is that Jesus broke under the weight of the cross and could no longer bear its load. It's likely that Jesus was carrying just the horizontal beam. We've got a mock one over here as a prop. It's possible that he was carrying just that horizontal beam. And it's estimated that it would have weighed in the neighborhood of 100 pounds. Now imagine, you're carrying 100 pounds for a half a mile uphill on rough stone road. At some point along the way, the burden became so great that Jesus collapsed under the weight. Luke put it like this. He said, a great multitude of people followed him, and women also mourned for him. I want you to imagine a moment the scene. Jesus with the cross beam on his shoulders, driven by the Roman soldiers through the busy streets of Jerusalem, makes his way northward toward the Damascus gate, and somewhere along the way, the burden of that beam becomes too much for him to bear, and his body breaks under the weight. Now, the question that I want to pose tonight is, what made this burden too great for Jesus to bear? Why was it? There were two other criminals crucified, two other men who were carrying beams just like the beam that Jesus carried, two other men that seemingly made it from the Antonia fortress, the half mile to Calvary, carrying the weight. Why was it that the burden was so great, too great for Jesus to bear? I want to suggest three things. The first is this: the physical burden of the cross. According to Mark 15, the crucifixion took place around 9 a.m. Mark wrote this way: "Now it was the third hour, and they crucified him." So that would be measured from 6 a.m., from the time the sun would rise. 3 hours later, Jesus is crucified. Therefore, we can assume that he broke under the weight of the cross around 8:30 in the morning. Since his trial the night before carried through the night, we assume that Jesus has been awake now for roughly 30 hours. What was he doing during those 30 hours? What did those 30 hours look like? In one sense, Jesus was just bearing the weight of a normal day. He woke up, presumably at sunrise on the day before. Jesus and his disciples, when they made their pilgrimage to Jerusalem, they would stay in a place called Bethany. And Bethany was just over the Mount of Olives from Jerusalem, roughly a 2-mile walk. We're told that day that they walked from Bethany to Jerusalem. When they arrived, he and his disciples planned or prepared for a feast. It was the largest feast, the most important feast on the Jewish calendar. It was Passover. He sent his disciples ahead to prepare a room that they would use for Passover. We're told that at that Passover meal and then following it, that Jesus spent the evening teaching his disciples some of his greatest sermons on servanthood, on the person and the work of the Holy Spirit, on the fact that he's the vine and we are the branches, and on prayer were given that night. Jesus closed out that day in lonely prayer. He spent hours alone with the Father. I think that alone, that day, if we went for a long walk, we hosted a feast for at least 13 people, we taught several Bible studies, and we spent hours in prayer, I think we'd all sleep good that night, wouldn't we? In addition to that, we're told that this was not a normal day. We know that Jesus' prayer time was interrupted when Judas arrived with a mob. They were armed. They took him by force from Gethsemane, which is back on the Mount of Olives, and they took him to Caiaphas' house. I took a picture while we were in Israel last week, and this is a model of the city of Jerusalem. I think we have that. And I don't know how well you can see that. I can't from where I am, but the closest structure that you see is the Temple Mount. See that red-roofed structure perpendicular to our view? If you follow that, you see a series of buildings just off that would be the, hold on, I got to do the never eat shredded wheat. So just off the west corner, the southwest corner, that's how I navigate. That's why I'm always lost, okay? So off that, you see all those buildings in that region? That was sort of the wealthy area of the city. Where you're looking from would essentially be the Mount of Olives. And Jesus and his disciples, Jesus now being arrested, would have been taken by force down the Mount of Olives, over the Kidron Valley, through the city, and over to the western area of the city where Caiaphas' home was. Now, it was there at Caiaphas' house that Jesus would stand before a tribunal, and he would be charged and convicted of blasphemy. Mark writes this way: "The high priest tore his clothes and said, 'What further need do we have of witnesses? You heard this blasphemy. What do you think?' And they all condemned Jesus to be deserving of death." At that point, we're told that in a fury of rage, they blindfolded Jesus. They spit on him. They beat him. They struck him with the palms of their hands, all the while mocking him, saying, "Prophesy to us, Christ. Who is it that struck you?" When dawn finally arrived, the religious leaders dragged Jesus from Caiaphas' home. If we could bring that picture up again. From Caiaphas' home, that's the southwest corner, those buildings over there, over to the Antonia fortress. And if you're looking at that big structure in the forefront of the picture, if you look to the right and see the tall towers, that was the fortress built by Herod that would house the Roman government, that would bring him there to the Antonia fortress. And there he was brought before Pilate, the Roman governor. We're told this: Pilate then went out to them and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" And they answered and said, "If he were not an evildoer, we would not have delivered him up to you." Then Pilate said, "You take him and judge him according to your law." Therefore the Jews said, "It is not lawful for us to put anyone to death." They brought Jesus to Pilate because they wanted his execution to be public, because they wanted to humiliate him and his disciples. And from this point, they'll spend the next 3 hours convincing Pilate to crucify Jesus. After questioning him and discovering that Jesus was a Galilean, Pilate sent him back over to the western region of the city, that same area where Caiaphas' home was, to the home of Herod. And before Herod, Jesus was vehemently accused, treated with contempt, mocked, arrayed in a gorgeous robe, and then sent back once again from the western area back over to the Antonia fortress. In another attempt to release Jesus, Pilate made an offer. He said, "How about the crowd gets to choose between either Jesus or a murderer, Barabbas?" And he offered Barabbas or Jesus to the crowd, and they cried out to set Barabbas free and to crucify Jesus. And at this point, we read that Jesus was scourged. Mark simply puts it like this: So Pilate, wanting to gratify the crowd, released Barabbas to them and delivered Jesus, after he had scourged him, to be crucified. Now, the Bible doesn't comment upon the scourging process, and it's partly due to the fact that crucifixions were done openly and the process was known by most people. It was such a horrific form of death, was crucifixion, that the first century Roman orator Cicero wrote this: "The very mention of the cross should be far removed, not only from the Roman citizen's body, but from his mind and his eyes and his ears." During the siege of Jerusalem, the hillside was littered with crucified victims. Seneca wrote that there were a whole variety of different styled crosses that were being used. There were so many people that they were putting to death through this method that they were just making rudimentary crosses to nail them to. A century before, in a slave uprising, there were 6,000 slaves who had rose up against Rome, who were all crucified at once. The Roman scourge was the first part of this crucifixion process. We're told that a victim would be bound to a post, stripped of their clothing, and beaten with a Roman flagrum. We have another picture we want you to see. And this is kind of an idea of what a Roman flagrum would have looked like. They found remains of one when they discovered or uncovered the remains of Pompeii. Consists of a handle with 2 or more leather strips, and then pieces of sharp metal or bone would be adhered to it. The leather would strike the back of the individual, and then the metal would tear it open. Eusebius, a 4th century historian, wrote this: "Bystanders were struck with amazement when they saw them lacerated with scourges, even to the innermost veins and arteries, so that the hidden inward parts of the body, both their bowels and their members, were exposed to view." Jesus beaten. After being severely beaten, Jesus was led before the Roman garrison, where they twisted a crown of thorns upon his head, clothed him in purple, struck him on the head with a reed, and spat on him and said, "Hail, King of the Jews." You know, it's not difficult to understand that the burden of the cross being too much for Jesus to bear. It's not difficult to see him break under the weight of that, somewhere between the Antonia fortress and the Damascus gate. But even after Jesus had collapsed, presumably from this physical burden, when they resumed the process, they went out the Damascus gate, they went up a hill called Golgotha, and the pain continued. It was there that Jesus was crucified. Matthew simply puts it like this. He says, "Then they crucified him." Again, no description given, no details given, because it was common, because people saw it happen. A doctor by the name of Truman Davis spent a lot of time researching crucifixion and the effect it would have upon the human body. He wrote this. He wrote, Simon of Cyrene, is ordered to place the beam on the ground, and Jesus quickly thrown backward with his shoulders against the wood. The legionnaire feels for the depression at the front of the wrist. He drives a heavy, square, wrought iron nail through the wrist and deep into the wood. Quickly, he moves to the other side, repeats the action, being careful not to pull the arms too tightly, but allows some flexion and movement. The cross is then lifted in place atop the vertical post, and the sign placed there reading, "Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews." The left foot is now pressed backward against the right foot, and both feet extended, toes down. A nail is driven through the arc of each, leaving the knees moderately flexed. The victim's crucified. As he slowly sags down with more weight on the nails in his wrist, excruciating pain shoots along the fingers and up the arms to explode in the brain. The nails on the wrists are putting pressure on the median nerves. As he pushes himself upward to avoid this stretching torment, he places his full weight on the nail through his feet. Again, there's searing agony of the nail tearing through the nerves between the metatarsal bones of the feet. At this point, as the arms fatigue, great waves of cramps sweep over the muscle, knotting them in deep, relentless, throbbing pain. With these cramps comes the inability to push himself upward. Hanging by his arms, the pectoral muscles are paralyzed and the intercostal muscles are unable to act. Air can be drawn into the lungs but can't be exhaled. Jesus fights to raise himself in order to get even one short breath. Finally, carbon dioxide builds up in the lungs and the bloodstream, and the cramps partially subside. Spasmodically, he is able to push himself upward to exhale and bring life-giving oxygen. Jesus experienced hours of limitless pain, cycles of twisting, joint-rendering cramps, intermittent partial asphyxiation, searing pain where tissue is torn from his lacerated back as he moves up and down against the rough timber. Then another agony begins, a terrible, crushing pain deep in the chest as his pericardium slowly fills with serum and begins to compress the heart. One remembers again the 22nd Psalm, "I'm poured out like water, all my bones are out of joint, my heart is like wax, it's melted in the midst of my bowels." It's now almost over. The loss of tissue fluid has reached a critical level. The compressed heart is struggling to pump heavy, thick, sluggish blood into the tissue. The tortured lungs are making a frantic effort to gasp in small gulps of air. The markedly dehydrated tissues send their flood of stimuli to the brain. Jesus gasped his fifth cry, "I thirst." One remembers again the 22nd Psalm, "My strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue cleaves to my jaws, and you have brought me into the dusts of death." A sponge soaked in cheap wine, which was the staple drink of the Roman legionaries, is lifted to his lips. He apparently doesn't take it. The body of Jesus is now in extremes. He can feel the chill of death creeping through his tissue. This realization brings out his 6 words, possibly little more than a tortured whisper, "It's finished." His mission of atonement has completed. Finally, he can allow his body to die. With one last surge of strength, he once again presses his torn feet against the nail, straightens his legs, takes a deeper breath, and utters the final cry, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. And this took 6 hours. Jesus upon the cross. It's not difficult to understand why the body of Jesus collapsed under the burden of the cross. But Jesus experienced a lot more than the physical burden of the cross. The Bible also explains for us the emotional burden that Jesus endured. In Hebrews chapter 4, we're told that Jesus was in all points tempted as we are. That is to say that Jesus took on human flesh, and Jesus had the emotions and that raged through your mind and body just like they raged through his. One thing that he experienced, he bore the burden of betrayal. We read in Mark's gospel, Judas, one of the 12, went to the chief priest to betray him to them. And they said, "What are you willing to give me if I deliver him to you?" And they counted out 30 pieces of silver. Oops. Be a couple $100. Jesus sold out by one of his closest friends for 30 pieces of silver. David wrote of the pain of betrayal. Psalm 55, we read this. Verse 4, "My heart is severely pained within me, and the terrors of death have fallen upon me. Fearfulness and trembling have come upon me, and horror has overwhelmed me. So I said, oh, that I had wings like a dove. I would fly away and be at rest. Indeed, I would wander off and remain in the wilderness." Later in that same psalm, in the 12th verse, he begins to explain to us why it was that he felt the way he did. He tells us this, "For it's not an enemy who reproaches me, then I could bear it. Nor is it one who hates me, who has exalted himself against me, then I could hide from him." He says, "But it was you, a man, my equal, my companion, my acquaintance." He says, "We took sweet counsel together and we walked to the house of God in the throng." Listen, he's talking about this incredible agony that he's experiencing, and the agony was the result of the burden of betrayal. In addition to physical suffering, Jesus also bore the weight of betrayal. Some of you know what that's like. Some of you know what that feels like. Jesus also bore the burden of knowing what was coming. You know, sometimes the fear of what might happen is so gripping to us, but real fear is when we know what is happening. Jesus had that kind of fear. Luke records the heartbreak of Jesus over what he knew was going to happen. In Luke 19 at verse 41, we read this. "Now as he, Jesus, drew near, he saw the city of Jerusalem and he wept over it." Here we find Jesus brokenhearted, weeping over the city of Jerusalem, saying, "If you had known, even you, especially this your day, the things that make for your peace, but now they are hidden from your eyes." It says, "For the days will come when your enemy will build an embankment around you, surround you, close you in on every side, and level you and your children within you to the ground. And they will not leave in you one stone upon another, because you did not know the time of your visitation." Jesus wept and he prophesied the time of the destruction of the city of Jerusalem. Josephus, the Jewish historian, described the event. He tells us that during the uprising, it would take place some 30 years later. An uprising, it would last for about 6 years. He writes that 1 million people died and 100,000 were taken into slavery. The city of Jerusalem was burned. The temple was leveled, not one stone left standing upon another. Last week we stood on a first century street with the rubble from the temple, from Herod's temple. We're standing next to the rubble, not one stone of the temple standing upon another. Jerusalem destroyed, the people killed. Later we went to Masada, or earlier we went to Masada, where the final 960 Jewish holdouts, men, women, children, they held off the Roman units for a year until defeat was imminent, and then they took their own lives. And the nation was defeated because they'd rejected their Messiah. Jesus knew that was coming. He knew that when they failed to respond to him, that's what was coming. The horrors of the people that he'd come to redeem having to experience because of the rejection of him. We also know that Jesus bore the burden of loneliness. We're told that he came to his own, and his own did not receive him. We know that the night before he broke under the weight of the cross, he'd entered into Gethsemane, where he prayed in isolation for hours while the disciples left. It was there in the garden that he sweat drops of blood. Mark tells us that Jesus made this statement to his disciples. He said, "My soul is exceedingly sorrowful unto death." Luke tells us, and being in agony, he prayed more earnestly. Then his sweat became like great drops of blood falling to the ground. This is known medically as hematidrosis, or blood sweat. One medical site put this: not much is known about what causes hematidrosis, but it is thought to be the result of extreme stress and fear. Leonardo da Vinci wrote of soldiers sweating drops of blood before entering into battle, so overcome with fear and stress. And here Jesus, about to do battle at the cross, is sweating drops of blood. Listen, it's not difficult to understand how the body of Jesus would collapse even under the emotional burden of the cross. But Jesus was experiencing far more than physical and emotional burden at the cross. Thirdly, there was a spiritual burden that Jesus was bearing, a spiritual weight that was upon him. The cross was the purpose for which Jesus came into the world. That's why he came. In most cases, we might say that a person's death is significant because of their life. Just 2 days ago, or maybe it was yesterday, I was talking with Mike, and he said that he remembered the day that JFK was shot. And America shut down. Everything was closed. The nation shut down. Some of you can remember it. I don't. Some of you can. And things shut down. Why? His death was significant because of his life. But listen, we could say that in Jesus' case, his life is significant because of his death. Jesus is the one man who was born to die. In Mark's gospel, Jesus told us this: the Son of Man did not come to be served. He came to serve, listen, and to give his life as a ransom. In John's gospel, Jesus said, "As Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up, that whoever believes in him will not perish, but will have life." As a result of that, Luke tells us that it came to pass when the time had come for him to be lifted up, that he steadfastly set his face towards Jerusalem. We read in Matthew's gospel that Peter at one time tried to impede Jesus' progress to the cross. And he was met with one of the starkest, most powerful rebukes you'll ever hear. He heard Jesus say, "Get behind me, Satan." And then listen to what he said: you are an offense to me. That's powerful. You know, I think this is parenthetical. We're stepping away from this. This is a point of application. But I think we might do well if we listened a little bit more closely to the voice of Jesus. We might hear him say what we're doing is an offense to him. He's standing in the way of the cross, standing in the way of Jesus fulfilling that which he came to fulfill. Nothing could stand between Jesus and the cross, because the cross is the means by which man could be brought into relationship with God. It's the cross where salvation is made possible. Paul put it like this. He said, the message of the cross is foolishness to those that are perishing. But to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. Later, Paul would say this to the Corinthians, I determined not to know anything among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. That's all that matters. And it's because it's through the cross that we can be reconciled to God. This is symbolized when they're upon the cross as Jesus breathes his last. We read about the intense agony that he would go through in order to be able to speak from the cross. And he says, it's finished. And he says, into your hands I commit my spirit. And Matthew tells us that at that point, that the veil of the temple was symbolically torn in two from the top to the bottom, making access to God possible. We can be reconciled to God because Jesus bore our sin and took upon himself the judgment of God. Peter put it this way. Peter wrote, he himself bore our sins in his body on the tree. What's the spiritual weight of the cross? Jesus bearing our sin on his body. Paul went on to say this. He said, he made him who knew no sin, perfect life, never ever experiencing the guilt, the sorrow, the pain that accompanies sinful behavior. He who knew no sin became sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God in him. The cross is an exchange. It's an exchange where my sin is placed upon Jesus and his righteousness is freely granted to me. The burden of the cross was that Jesus would bear the weight, not of a wooden beam. He wouldn't bear the weight of his own body hanging from nails. He would bear the weight of the sin of humanity. Every one of us in this room know the weight of sin. Every one of us know the weight of the guilt of our own sinfulness. We know what it is to feel as though our body weighs twice its mass. We know what it is to barely be able to function, barely be able to move forward because of something that we've done, some way that we've violated the law of God and we've harmed someone that we love. Imagine that weight magnified, multiplied by the billions of sins that we've committed and the billions of people that are on the planet. And all of that is laid upon Jesus, and all of the horrors of sin rest upon his shoulders. Listen, the burden of the weight of sin is so great because with it comes the weight of divine judgment. Paul, writing to the Galatians, put it like this. He says, Christ, having redeemed us from the curse of the law. Here's how. Having become a curse for us. That's the cross. The judgment that should have rested upon you and I rested upon Jesus. We read in Romans 5, having been justified by his blood, we shall be saved from wrath through him. Writing to the Thessalonians, Paul said, for God did not appoint us to wrath, but to obtain salvation through our Lord Jesus Christ, who died for us. The spiritual weight of the cross that Jesus would endure was the weight, first of all, of my sin and yours being placed upon him. All the horrors of humanity's sin placed on him. In addition to that, because those sins were placed on him, because he took our place, because he was our substitute, the judgment of God that would be poured out upon you and I because of our sin, that horrific wrath that would be poured out, was poured out upon Jesus. And so from the cross, he made a statement that would be so absolutely and utterly shocking in heaven. He said, my God, why have you forsaken me? The judgment of sin, separation from God, was placed upon the shoulders of Jesus Christ. That's the burden of the cross. That's what Jesus bore. That's the true reason that Jesus was sweating blood in the garden. That's the real reason why the weight of that beam was too much for him to carry. And he collapsed somewhere there in the city, heading from the Antonia fortress out the Damascus gate. And he broke under that weight because he was bearing the weight of our sin, and he would bear the weight of our judgment. Tonight, we have the blessing of being able to benefit from the work that Jesus did. We have the blessing of being able to be set free from our sin and brought into relationship with God through the cross. One way to look at the cross is this. The cross is the doorway. It's the gateway. It's the gateway into relationship with God. It's the gateway into eternal life. The Bible tells us that today Jesus sits upon a throne in heaven. That throne's titled for us. It's called the throne of grace. And from it, mercy flows out for every failure you'll ever commit, and grace flows out for every weakness you'll ever have. But the way to get to the throne of grace is to go through the doorway of the cross. It's the cross that makes it possible. It's the cross that makes it that you and I can be reconciled to God. It's the cross that makes it possible for us to have the free gift of eternal life. And so Jesus told us we should celebrate the cross. Jesus told us that whenever we wanted to, we could take two simple elements, bread and the fruit of the vine. The bread would represent his body. We read tonight how it was broken. The fruit of the vine would represent his blood. That which makes our forgiveness possible. That which makes reconciliation with God available to all of us. And we can partake of that. We're going to have the worship team. They're going to make their way back up. And in just a moment, we're going to ask the ushers to come and pass out the elements. And two things I want you to keep in mind. Number one, I want you to keep in mind that the offer of salvation is made available to everyone. And so if you have yet to just say, Jesus, I'm a sinner, and I thank you that you did all that for me, and I ask you to come into my life and forgive me of my sins, just do that now. Right now. You don't need to articulate it. You think anything I would ever say is going to impress God? Don't worry. Just say, God, I need you. I receive you. And then the second thing to keep in mind is this is an expression of his great love for us. The Bible tells us that the driving force behind all that Jesus endured and all the Father endured watching his Son was because of his great love for us. And so let's bask in his love tonight. Let's be reminded that that's all for us. Jesus didn't do that begrudgingly. Jesus didn't hang on the cross and say, you just wait, he did it lovingly. We're told by the writer of Hebrews that he did it because there was a joy that was in front of him. And that joy was you. That joy was the fact that you would be brought into a relationship with God and spend eternity with him.